Hello, everybody. Greetings, good afternoon, and welcome to our weekly webinar series this week. The topic is Flashpoint Korea, Standoff on the Peninsula, a very dramatic title, and we have a great panel of distinguished experts here. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator. Dr. Michael Jenkins is the president of Washington Times Foundation and chairman of Washington Times Holdings, the company that owns the Washington Times news organization, as well as president of Universal Peace Federation International. He has been director or is director of the Northeast Asia Peace Initiative, which often conducts fact-finding trips to Korea and other initiatives, and also the Middle East Peace Initiative, which have worked since the 1980s on conflict resolution projects on the Pacific Rim and in Israel and Palestine. Dr. Jenkins, welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you to you, Larry Moffett, our Secretary General of the Universal Peace Federation, for putting this program together. And I want to welcome our audience. This is part of a series of webinars we've been doing since December 17th on North Korea, on the Indo-Pacific region, on peace in that region and how we can advance peace. We are seeking to strengthen the alliance of America with its allies and learn how we can engage all the parties that are there in Northeast Asia. Our first panelist today is a renowned ambassador. Ambassador Joseph Detrani is the former U.S. Special Envoy to the six-party talks. He serves on the board of managers of Sandia National Laboratories that gives stewardship over our U.S. nuclear arsenal. He has served as president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance, a think tank that advances intelligence and national security priorities. He's a former U.S. representative of the Korea Energy Development Organization, KEDO, and Ambassador Detrani served over 2 decades with the CIA as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service. Part of that time, he was the Associate Director of National Intelligence and the Mission Manager for North Korea. He has led a number of the Washington Times fact finders to Korea, and we have found a great rapport with the decision makers in Korea, both in the Blue House as well as the Parliament, as well as in the intelligence services. Welcome, Ambassador Joseph Detrani.
Michael, thank you. It's an honor being here. Thank you to UPF for having these webinars on a subject that's as important as North Korea. So I'd just like to take a few minutes just to sort of set the scene. And I look forward to this conversation with my distinguished colleagues and Larry, all friends and all very concerned citizens and experts on North Korea. Let me just set the scene by saying we're talking about a North Korea, and I think everyone knows that has a significant nuclear arsenal. We're talking about between 10 to 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. These nuclear weapons, the assessment is these nuclear weapons can be miniaturized, they can be mated to missile delivery systems, and we're talking about intermediate range ballistic missiles to include intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Hwasong-14, the Hwasong-15. Most recently, we saw the Hwasong-16, which was a gigantic ICBM, fortunately not launched, but apparently capable of delivering multiple nuclear warheads. So when we talk about North Korea, we're talking about a country with significant nuclear arsenal. And they produce the fissile material, both plutonium and highly enriched uranium, to produce these nuclear warheads. And the missiles are very sophisticated. I mentioned the ICBMs of a reach that could reach the whole of the continental United States. We're also talking about submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So that's very significant. And on the military side, on the nuclear side, a very, I would say, advanced nuclear weapons state. We recognize the fact that they have these nuclear weapons, although we've not seen them per se, but we've seen the tests, 6 tests. So we recognize that, but we do not accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. And indeed, the objective has been for 26 years is moving towards denuclearization, complete verifiable denuclearization. But on the other side, the economy side, North Korea is going through a bad patch right now, especially with COVID-19 and the shutting down the economy and the sanctions that are really biting in a significant way. Even trade with China has literally been stopped. So North Korea is going through a very difficult period at this moment. But even prior to COVID-19, we were talking about a country with over 40%, according to the United Nations, 40% malnourishment in the population. So significant economic imperatives here. But what has driven the United States, working with our allies in South Korea and Japan, with our partners in China and Russia, as we work the denuclearization issue, is how do we get North Korea to denuclearize completely verifiably? How do we get North Korea to be part of the family of nation states so that we can lift of these sanctions so that we don't move forward in that direction? And we get foreign direct investment. We look at the movement and towards a more normal relationship with North Korea. Well, we've been negotiating with them for 26 years, as I mentioned. We started with the agreed framework, and we had some success with the agreed framework. They halted their program for close to 8 years, and they shut down 2 facilities, 50 megawatt and a 200 megawatt facility, and they've never restarted those facilities. But that came apart in 2002, and we had the 6-party talks, and we had a joint statement of 2005, and we had some success with that, where they stopped producing, if you will, fissile material, plutonium, for their nuclear weapons. And that stopped in the early part of 2009. And most recently, we had President Donald Trump meeting in Singapore with Kim Jong-un, and we had the Singapore Declaration, which committed to a transformation of our relationship with North Korea. We talked about complete verifiable denuclearization. We talked about a peace treaty to end the Korean War and the repatriation of American soldiers, troops who were lost in the Korean War. Unfortunately, having said all that, unfortunately, we're at a very significant juncture right now. And the issue right now is, how do we move forward with North Korea? They continue to produce fissile material for nuclear weapons, and they're working on their missile delivery systems. We heard the speech of Chairman Kim Jong-un in January at the 8th Party Congress, where he said North Korea is going to enhance their nuclear weapons capability. They're talking about hypersonic missiles. They're talking about tactical nuclear weapons. They're talking about submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They're talking about ICBMs that have a reach of over 15,000 kilometers. So we're talking about a North Korea that needs to come back to negotiations. And it's been the US reaching out to North Korea, and North Korea has been the one saying they're not prepared, but to go back to negotiations. But we have a number of options here. The community has a number of options here. One of the options now is what North Korea would like, to accept them as a nuclear weapons state. This has been, I've been working with North Korea for 13 of the last 16 years. And continually, they talk about we can have a good relationship with the United States and others. We will never use our nuclear weapons because it's for deterrence purposes. And that's sort of understandable given the neighborhood they live in with these big countries all around them and the history of the Korean Peninsula. But the fact of the matter is, not accepting North Korea with nuclear weapons, we're talking about the possibility of a nuclear arms race in the region, South Korea, Japan, even maybe Taiwan. We're talking about the possibility of proliferation, where it could be sold in nuclear weapons or fissile material to terrorist organizations. And so that's one option I think we've taken off the table, and I think we should. Because we're talking about complete verifiable denuclearization, that will lend to stability. The other option is to continue the way we are now. More sanctions, more missile defense, greater deterrence capabilities in South Korea and Japan, and so forth. Now, going down that path, we're going to have tension in the region. I don't know how we're going to talk about reunification with that scenario. And also China and Russia. Will they abide? Will they implement sanctions? Will they be on board with the policy along that line? So my default on this is going back to negotiations, getting North Korea pursuant to what they agreed to in 2005 and 1994, but also certainly in Singapore in 2018. And they said this also to South Korea. If they move towards complete verifiable denuclearization in an action for action format. And I'll end on this point. We saw the failure of negotiations recently with North Korea in Hanoi in February of 2019. And that's when we approached North Korea saying, you denuclearize and then we'll start lifting sanctions. That's just not going to happen. We have 26 years of experience with them. It's got to be actions for actions, commitments for commitments. They are not going to denuclearize and feel vulnerable because security is the major issue for North Korea. So if we can move forward and give them the security assurances and move forward with the lifting of sanctions as they denuclearize completely verifiably, and we have monitors on the ground, I think that would be the approach that we want to look forward to. And hopefully with the Biden administration, and they're going through a review right now, they will reach out to North Korea and hopefully North Korea will respond. But again, the point here is North Korea has to understand we're talking about complete verifiable denuclearization in a process of, in my view, actions for actions. They will get reciprocal deliverables as they move towards denuclearization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We are very honored by your presentation. Also, I want to mention to the audience that Ambassador Detrani is fluent in Chinese, and through his years of work, he has also kept good relations with representatives of China, Russia, and North Korea, which has become extremely invaluable for communications ongoing. I'd like to introduce at this time Mr. Joel S. Witt. He's a senior fellow with the Stimson Center and director of Stimson's 38 North Project. He is one of the world's preeminent observers and analysts for Northeast Asia and security issues.
Michael, did you lose your sound? Dr. Jenkins, did you lose your sound?
I think he was disconnected.
Okay, let me just finish then what he was going to say. Joel Witt, Mr. Witt, as Dr. Jenkins said, is a senior fellow with the Stimson Center, director of the Stimson Center's very fine 38 North Project, the go-to source for the quickest information on what's going on in North Korea, and is also one of the foremost analysts of and observers of Northeast Asia's security issue. He also has experience in the policy world from his time at State Department. He helped negotiate the 1994 US-DPRK agreed framework, and then he headed up the oversight of its implementation. He spent a lot of time sitting across the table from North Korean officials for the better part of a decade. His book, Going Critical, The First North Korea Nuclear Crisis, which he co-authored with two other gentlemen, won the American Academy of Diplomacy's 2004 Prize for Best Work. You can see him frequently in the commentary pages of the New York Times and Foreign Policy, as well as offering expert testimony on current issues for things like Wolf Blitzer's Situation Room on CNN, as well as PBS, NBC, and others. Mr. Witt, it's a pleasure to have you. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's session. Let me talk to you very briefly about a strategy for dealing with North Korea. And the key word is a strategy, because I think too often sessions like this turn into a discussion of whether to engage North Korea or not engage North Korea. And I think that largely misses the point. And the point is, what should our strategy be? What is driving America, or what should drive American policy? So what do I mean by that? Let me make 6 brief points. Point number one, for the Biden administration, certainly, and most previous administrations, the most important element of our policy in Northeast Asia has been to maintain our alliances. Yet North Korea's continued development of long-range missiles and more capable, powerful warheads threatens our security umbrella that protects South Korea, and it threatens the continuation of the alliance itself. Second point, if the challenge grows, and it's quite possible it will, and our umbrella, extended deterrence, is in trouble, we may be confronted with South Korean requests to redeploy American nuclear weapons to the region, to the peninsula, or South Korea may decide to go its own way and build its own weapons. Now, I know that may sound far-fetched to some people, but actually in 2016, the South Koreans were on the verge of making that request. And this was at the end of the Obama administration. So you can be sure if the threat continues to grow, we're going to have to confront that issue again. Point three, our strategy needs to deal with this potential problem, the potential problem that could result in the nuclearization of Northeast Asia. So aside from steps to increase confidence in the alliance, and I'm not going to get into those at the moment, what we need to do is pursue negotiations, first of all, with North Korea that have the near-term objective of heading off this problem, of stopping North Korea's development of long-range missiles and more powerful nuclear warheads. What does that translate into in terms of a negotiating strategy? Well, for me, the bottom line in the near term is ending North Korea's development of these weapons. And not only ending the development, but also shutting down their main nuclear facility, the Yongbyon nuclear facility, where they produce nuclear isotopes that are used to build hydrogen bombs. It's not what you often hear. You hear a lot of people saying, oh, we should end North Korea's production of fissile material everywhere in the country. Well, first of all, that's not achievable in the near term. But secondly, that does not solve our near-term security problem. So we're not dropping, I agree with Joe, we're not dropping the goal of denuclearization. I think the only person who ever thought that was possible in the near term was John Bolton. It's always a long-term objective. And the North Koreans are going to buy onto that. They may have a fantasy of becoming a nuclear power, but they have consistently said denuclearization can be a long-term goal. Point four, sanctions can play an important role in this effort. I think it's possible to tighten the existing regime and maybe add a few new sanctions. And here's where I disagree with a lot of people. The bottom line is that turning up sanctions pressure will require a head-on collision with the Chinese, because a lot of the sanctions are going to be against entities in China. And an issue that administration after administration has had to confront is that practical? Because we have a lot of other equities that we need to deal with in terms of our relations with China. So sanctions lifting, on the other hand, may have more negotiating value than imposing new ones. Point five, just a throwaway, of course, we should work with our allies on this, particularly South Korea. We're already starting that process. And point six, we should work with the Chinese, but we shouldn't have any illusions. Too many American administrations have thought China was going to solve this problem for us, and they never have. It's never going to happen. So our objective should be to make sure China does no harm. Of course, there's no guarantee all of this is going to work, but what we need is a hard-headed strategy based on reality, not on slogans, not on myths, not on illusions. And above all, we need one based on our national interests and those of our allies. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Witt.
I'm here.
Our
Larry.
next speaker.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay,
Thank you,
Michael's
Mr.
here.
Joel Witt, S Witt. Thank you very much. And we want you to know how much we appreciate 38 North as a really very substantive journal on everything going on day to day with North Korea. I apologize for the technical problems we've had, but we'll go right forward. Mr. Jim Fennell retired from the United States Navy in 2015, concluding a 30-year career as a naval intelligence officer specializing in Indo-Asia Pacific security affairs, with an emphasis on the Chinese Navy and its operations. His most recent assignment was as Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He spent much of his career in the Pacific region, highlighted by tours as the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence for the U.S. 7th Fleet aboard the USS Blue Ridge.
And it looks like he may have gotten bounced out again. I'll pick up where he left off. He was also the senior intelligence officer in the Office of Naval Intelligence, and as the senior intelligence officer for the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier strike group. It was Captain Fennell's job to know where the PRC and the North Korean military was and what they were doing 24/7, year after year. Following military service, he was a National Security Affairs Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, where he studied Chinese national, political, and security affairs. He speaks and writes frequently on intelligent matters, and I believe he's coming to us today from Switzerland, where he currently lives. Captain Fennell, thank you so much for joining us. It's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Larry, and I'm honored to be with this group today. Clearly, these are the experts on North Korea, and at a strategic level, you've heard some very wise wisdom from these experts. I would just, my contribution to this forum was more in vain at the operational level and dealing with the practicalities of the 6 points that Mr. Witt outlined, or Ambassador Detrani. If these things don't work, somebody on the other end is going to have to deal with the situation. And in the naval arena, which is where I was focused, I didn't have responsibility to watch all of North Korea, but the naval portion was something that I spent quite a bit of time on. And when I was preparing for this event, I went and prepared a timeline of kind of key events that occurred in the naval history with North Korea. And I think a lot of people recall 1996, 1998, when North Korean submarines washed ashore, Sango and Yugo submarines washed ashore in those 2 years. And a lot of their naval personnel and their reconnaissance bureau personnel were either committed suicide or murdered the sailors that were there. And it kind of demonstrated in a lot of people's mind that the North Korean Navy wasn't something that you really had to worry about. And many of us inside, I think the intelligence community of the United States had that kind of belief that they weren't really a threat and something that we had to worry about. We had other larger fish to fry, if you will, in the Pacific. But then in March of 2010, when I was at the 7th Fleet on the USS Blue Ridge, a South Korean corvette was sunk by a North Korean midget submarine, a Yono-class midget submarine, and killed 45, 46 South Korean sailors. And the reason I mention this is because we've now seen here in January and last October, Kim Jong-un at these nighttime parades parade around these submerged launch ballistic missiles, the Puk Song 1, maybe now the 5 here in January, and that these missiles are an indicator of the efforts that KJU and the North are taking towards having some kind of viable submerged launch ballistic missile capability. And while it's not a significant threat in terms of their capacity, in terms of the range of the missiles or their ability to operate at sea because they're quite noisy, I like to remind people that in 2010, we didn't think the North Koreans could put a midget submarine underway and sink a South Korean corvette and do the damage that they did. So I think one of the things that we have to remember is that while they may be a backward nation compared to the United States in terms of military power, the things that we discuss in terms of nuclear capabilities and the ability to field that in a ballistic missile submarine, even as rudimentary as it is, the idea that we would have to follow them and track them 24/7 and hold their platform at risk is no small effort. And so in a way, while it's been largely quiet over the last 4 years of the previous administration, these demonstrations here last October and now in January, to me, are an indicator that we may be seeing more testing from the North on this new administration. And it's going to require, as Mr. Witt said, we're going to have to be hard-headed about this in some sense. And we're going to have to be able to deal with the reality of what the North is doing while we're in these negotiations. And I think that's something that, it's not so much a deterrent, it's the ability to deal with a loose submarine that could be able to fire some kind of ballistic missile that may not be able to reach the continental United States, but it could do damage to Guam, Hawaii. And worse than that, in my opinion, is the damage that it could do to our allies in Japan or South Korea. And the idea that they could launch a nuclear missile and have it detonate in one of those countries and what that would do to the situation. And so I think I fundamentally agree with Mr. Witt in terms of his idea about we have to work with the PRC, but we should have no illusion that they're going to be the solution to this. And we have to be our own solution, and we have to be able to, in a sense, contain the capabilities that the North Koreans could list on us. And one way to do that is through, as mentioned, alliances, but in the intelligence arena, this idea of intelligence professionals across the board having kind of a federated approach of how we track and follow North Korea. And so it's this alliance between the United States intelligence community on the peninsula, back in Hawaii, back in Washington, with the South Korean government, with the South Korean military. In my case, when I was at 7th Fleet, I had very close contacts with my counterparts at Busan, at ROK Fleet, and then when I was at Pacific Fleet with my counterparts at Daecheon at the ROK Navy headquarters. And the relationships that were built over a decade plus are something that's really important. And then finally, I'd add in this idea of the federation of intelligence, because there is another major player there in our alliance structure, and that's Japan, and trying to bring along our friends in Korea and our friends in Japan and the United States to have this trilateral sharing of intelligence about these very critically important things, so that we're maximizing the amount of brain power and collection capability and analytic capability and reconnaissance capability to be able to know where a new SIMPO ballistic missile submarine is 24 hours a day. Because unlike in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where we had a modicum of understanding about the Soviets and how they would deal with ballistic missiles at sea, and we have a bit of an understanding with the PRC, there's no guarantee that we'll have that kind of same understanding with North Korea. And so it puts a priority on being able to hold their ballistic missile submarine at risk anytime that it would leave port. And so I know I've kind of narrowed this down from the strategic thinking that the two previous speakers have had, but I think there's an operational reality here, as while these decisions about what new dialogue and new discussions are going on with the new American administration, we must not forget that we have a responsibility today to be able to hold that situation in check and be able to not let that get out of control. So thanks for your time, and I really appreciate being part of this.
Thank you, Jim. excellent presentation. We thank you for your work over the years to share intelligence and help all of our shared work together with South Korea and Japan and our allies. I think the GSOMIA Pact of trilateral security is so critical. And the Washington Times Fact Finder was there the year that it was first passed, and we were visiting the military in Japan, our joint base with Japan and the US, Air Force Base, and then also at Yokota. And then we also went to our bases with the UNC. And it was a tremendous change when the three nations could share that intelligence. At this time, I'm honored to present to you Colonel David Maxwell. He's a 30-year veteran of the US Army. He retired in 2011, Special Forces Colonel, with his final assignment serving the military faculty teaching and national security strategy at the National War College. His military service was spent partly in Europe and mostly in Asia, especially in Korea, where he was a planner on the commander staff of the UNC Combined Forces Command, US Forces Korea. He was co-author of the original plan for dealing with the eventuality that the DPRK's instability may lead to collapse. He also served in a number of pivotal positions, Japan and the Philippines, including Chief of Staff for Special Operations Command of the 1st Battalion, 1st Special Forces Group Airborne in Okinawa, and Chief of Staff of the US Army Special Forces Operations Command. He's also commanded the Joint Special Operations Task Force Philippines. Welcome, Colonel David Maxwell.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to address this conference and what I think we all agree is a very critical topic. I would like to discuss just a few key considerations for the Biden Korea policy review that hopefully will help contribute to shaping that process. The Biden administration's policy review really needs to focus on what I say are 6 key points, which may overlap and reinforce some of Joel Witt's 6 points as well. The first point is the policy review must begin with an understanding of what we want or need on the Korean Peninsula. It really must answer the question of what is the acceptable, durable political arrangement that will serve, protect, and advance US and ROK US alliance interests on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia. This is really job 1 for the policy review. And I would say the answer to that question is not denuclearization of the entire Korean Peninsula, which I think is a very problematic statement on many levels. But if we can get the answer to that question correct, all else will flow from there. We should also keep in mind that during the election, President Biden wrote one op-ed in the foreign press, in Yonhap News, and he provided his early look at his policy for the Korean Peninsula. And I quote, he said, "As president, I'll stand with South Korea, strengthening our alliance to safeguard peace in East Asia and beyond. Rather than extorting Seoul with reckless threats to remove our troops, I'll engage in principled diplomacy and keep pressing toward a denuclearized North Korea and a unified Korean Peninsula." I thought it was very interesting that the president at the time would talk about a unified Korean Peninsula. The second point is that a sound policy must be built on a rock-solid ROK-US alliance with sufficient trilateral cooperation with Japan. You know, there are many alliance issues that require attention, and I'll just give you a short list here. The Special Measures Agreement, which hopefully will be resolved very soon, in the next week or two, I hope. The OPCON transition, the conditions for this must be met to ensure the security of the Republic of Korea. Combined exercises, they're critical to maintaining readiness and for the OPCON transition process, but they cannot be negotiated away with the North, as some officials have recently mentioned. USFK access to training areas in Korea. This is a critical problem for maintaining readiness of US forces. Obviously, US-China competition has a significant impact on the alliance. And then other things is the pandemic response, the terrible friction with Japan, ROK and US trade issues, and climate change. You know, so our diplomats, military leaders, and trade and other government officials really must work to resolve these issues and others. The third point is the policy review must get the strategic assumptions right. You know, the Korea Watcher community is often divided between 2 assumptions. Advocates for engagement with the North assume that concessions and security guarantees can co-opt Kim. Advocates for a harder line assume external pressure will coerce him. And there's little evidence to suggest with confidence that either of these assumptions are correct or that a policy informed by them will succeed. Of course, there's a third assumption, and that is that a proper balance between engagement and pressure can achieve the desired strategic effects to serve our interests. However, I think even this will be insufficient. There's also the Moon administration assumption in support of his peace and reconciliation vision, or what I like to call the peace at any cost hope. The fundamental assumption is that Kim Jong-un shares a vision of peace and will seek an agreement with the South that will lead to peaceful coexistence. Now, this assumption, I think, is contrary to what we know and believe about the nature of the Kim family regime and its objectives. I would ask both the Moon and Biden administrations to answer two questions and analyze, discuss, and debate the answers to help get the assumptions about the objectives and nature of the Kim family regime right. Now, the first one is, do we believe that Kim Jong-un has abandoned the 7 decades old strategy of subversion, coercion, extortion, or blackmail diplomacy, and even the use of force to achieve unification, dominated by what I like to call the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state, in order to ensure the survival of the mafia-like crime family cult known as the Kim family regime? Yes, I recognize my bias here. The second point is, in support of that strategy, do we believe that Kim Jong-un has abandoned the objective to split the ROK-US alliance and get US forces off the peninsula? Has Kim given up his divide to conquer strategy, divide the alliance to conquer the ROK? There's also a third question that requires an answer to better understand the nature of the Kim family regime. Who does Kim Jong-un fear more, the United States or the Korean people living in the North? And I believe it is the Korean people armed with information and knowledge of life in the South that is really the existential threat to the Kim family regime. And the answers to these questions should guide us to the strategy to solve the Korea question, which is, of course, derived from paragraph 60 of the Armistice Agreement in 1953. And these answers will lead to the only acceptable, durable political arrangement to serve, protect, and advance our interests, which is what I would describe as a secure, stable, economically vibrant, non-nuclear Korean peninsula that is unified under a liberal constitutional form of government with respect for individual liberty, the rule of law, and human rights determined by the Korean people. In short, this is a united Republic of Korea, a U-ROK or U-ROK. My apologies for getting ahead of myself in previewing a proposed solution. But the critical point on assumptions is that the Moon and Biden administration must sufficiently align their assumptions. I would say that the Moon administration's naive assumption about the nature of the regime and its objectives could be the biggest friction point within the ROK-US alliance in the coming year. The fourth point is we must understand the South Korean political situation and the impact on timing between the ROK and the US. I think the Biden administration wants to move at deliberate speed and conduct a thorough review, detailed analysis, and develop a long-term approach to serve, protect, and advance US interests in the region, really as part of a holistic regional and global strategy. However, the Moon administration is on a much shorter timeline. That is really between now and this coming fall, when the South Korean election cycle will begin. While Moon himself is a lame duck president, he certainly wants to ensure there's a policy success with North Korea that will cement his legacy and set up his party to remain in power in the next presidential election. I think these different views on timing are going to bring stress on the alliance. The fifth point is, of course, the situation in North Korea, and much to talk about on that, but we must understand that the situation in the North, as best we can, since it remains, as Jim really outlined, one of the hardest intelligence targets in the world. It's suffering under the triple whammy: natural disasters, COVID response, and sanctions. While Kim has admitted failure of the North's economic plans, he really blames the triple whammy and does not accept personal responsibility. And most importantly, it is his internal pressure that is likely restraining him for the near term as he tries to implement more draconian population and resources control measures, really to further oppress the people in the North in order to protect the regime. And he has used the COVID outbreak really as an excuse to impose greater control over the population. The sixth and last point I want to make is that the Biden policy must take into account what I call the big five. The first is war. That's the worst case. We must deter it. But if attacked, we have to defend, we have to fight, and we have to win. Really, that's the number one military task that we're faced with. The second is regime instability and potential collapse. We must prepare for that real possibility and understand that such conditions could lead to war, and both war and regime collapse could result in terrible resistance inside North Korea for whomever intervenes, whether it's China, South Korea, or the alliance. Third is human rights and the crimes against humanity. There must be a focus on this because it is a threat to the Kim family regime. The focus on human rights undermines domestic legitimacy. It's a moral imperative, but it's also a national security issue because Kim Jong-un must deny human rights in order to remain in power. The fourth are, of course, the range of asymmetric threats, from provocation to proliferation, the nuclear and missile programs, cyber, extensive cyber operations around the world, its special operations forces, the active subversion of the Republic of Korea, and of course, its global illicit activities network. All of these combine to keep the Kim family regime in power and support to the nuclear program and the military. Lastly is the biggest challenge and the solution, and that's unification. This is something that the alliance should be focused on as in the long term. It's good that President Biden addressed this. Since President Lee and President Obama, President Park and President Obama, and President Moon and President Trump have all talked about unification in their vision statements, in their joint statements, and President Biden reinforced this in his Yonhap op-ed. So it's something that we should be looking forward to, and it should be part of policy and, as Joel Witt said, strategy for the long term. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Colonel Maxwell, thank you very much. And we have a few minutes for discussion and also some questions from our audience. One question has come in is that right now there's no dialogue between North and South Korea and the United States. There's been a lack of communication, and also, where do you expect the Biden administration to come forward in relationship with North Korea? How about Ambassador Detrani? Could you address your thoughts on that? And where should the Biden administration stand? What do you recommend?
Well, I mean, as allies, we're in sync with our goals for North Korea. I mean, we're talking about complete verifiable denuclearization, but we're also talking about security assurances for North Korea, eventually lifting sanctions as they move forward with the denuclearization, a peace treaty to end the Korean War. So there are variables there, but also there is the confidence building between the North and South. That's intra-Korean dialogue. I would hope that the Biden administration would look at getting South Korea to be more active in regards to a dialogue with the North. Now, we have sanctions that have been a significant imperative here, so much so that when we talk about possibly reopening Kaesong, the industrial complex in North Korea, where the North and South came together, while that could be in violation of certain sanctions. So I think these have to be parsed in a way so that the South Koreans can get an opportunity to have a dialogue with North Korea, to have some of the confidence building measures that are so necessary, whether it's the visits of the separated families from the Korean War, whether it's visits to Mount Kumgang and so forth. I think there needs to be more participation from the South Korean side on a dialogue with the North, because ultimately, as David and others have said, we're talking about reunification. And I think we have to have South Korea as very active with the United States, but also active independent of the United States in regard to North Korea. As long as our goals and objectives are the same and we're totally in sync in regards to the implementation of those strategies to accomplish the goals.
Thank you, Ambassador. Jim, some analysts are saying that the new hypersonic Icbms being developed by Russia and China and possibly North Korea are unstoppable, only using our current technology. And it seems that a year ago, the DARPA awarded $13 million to Northrop Grumman to study defense against hypersonic missiles. What's your analysis or thought on this? Are they stoppable? And do we have the capability to stop them?
Well, I mean, the hypersonic programs of Russia and China are the most advanced, and I would say China is even more advanced than Russia in some sense, given the number of tests, the successful tests that they've had. But in terms of North Korea, I think a lot of that is at this point, from what I've seen, is a lot of future wish list. I don't think they have the capability right today. But even presuming that they had some modicum of a capability, the hypersonic does provide a challenge to our defense, ballistic missile defense structure. And there's been a debate going on in the Pentagon over the last two administrations about whether you spend your money on defensive measures or you try to develop your own hypersonic capability. And the last administration had thought that maybe we need to spend a little bit of money on having the capability to have our own hypersonic capability, which didn't exist in the U.S. really in any serious way. And so I think there has to be a balance there. I think that's probably what you'll see as a kind of a going back towards a defensive capability, but it's something that's very, very difficult and it's going to cost billions. And so I think in the interim, we need to have our own capability, which is in a way a deterrent to other nations to try to use that capability.
Thank you, Jim. Joel, in the 8th Workers' Party Congress, Kim Jong-un said he was going to continue to build nuclear missiles and enhance them. What do you think he meant by enhancing them? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, look, the first point I like to make, and I think Jim Farrell is right on this, that, the North Koreans talk a good game and they know everyone's listening. So they're going to really hype their capabilities and lay out a laundry list of what they plan to do. Secondly, the technological direction of North Korea's missile program has been obvious for years. It's longer range missiles able to carry smaller nuclear warheads, miniaturized warheads, developing solid fuel missiles, not liquid fuel missiles, so they can be mobile. And, so this is straightforward. And the submarine part of it too, which is another new development. These are all technological directions that any country who has built a missile force pursues. Pakistan, the Soviet Union, the United States, others. So it's very straightforward.
Thank you. Very good. And Colonel Maxwell, CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. And now I hear that some are talking about CVD and dropping the irreversible. And I've also heard that, and we've read where Sid Seiler, National Director of Intelligence for North Korea, is also saying that denuclearization is not going to happen. It's not possible. What are your thoughts on that? And just dropping the I out of CVID, and what's your recommendations and thoughts on this as an analyst and planner?
Well, I of course defer to Joel and Ambassador Detrani with their experience negotiating with North Korea, but I think that my assessment is that Kim Jong-un has no intention of giving up his nuclear weapons, and I think our inaccurate acronyms CVID and FFVD and all of those different things we come up with, I don't really think they mean that much to North Korea, and so I think we change. Make some nuanced changes. I don't think that really impacts on negotiating, but I'd defer to our experts on that. I don't think that as long as Kim Jong-un is in power, that he is going to give up his nuclear weapons. He may negotiate, and hopefully will negotiate at least a freeze and perhaps some reduction. I really think that what he wants is to be recognized as a nuclear power and to enter into negotiations like we did with the Soviet Union, strategic arms limitation talks, strategic arms reduction talks, because that will certainly legitimize him, and it will allow him to keep his nuclear weapons. And so, and of course, what he needs most importantly is sanctions relief. So I think that he will continue to try to accomplish that. But as long as Kim Jong-un is in power and the Kim family regime is in power, I don't think they can give up their nuclear weapons. They're just too important to them. One, obviously, for deterrence, they believe that they must have them. I remember when Huang Zhongyap defected in 1997, and he told us that they needed nuclear weapons because they believe that the United States will not attack another country with nuclear weapons. So deterrence is number one. I think it gives them legitimacy. It gives them negotiating leverage, allows them to conduct their blackmail diplomacy. And of course, there is a certain element of pride, national pride to having those weapons. So I don't see any way for him to give them up. But that said, I'm all for, we have to engage, we have to negotiate, but I think we need a longer term strategy beyond the nuclear problem. And that strategy has to go beyond, the Kim Jong-un in power. We have to think the long term and take a long term approach to this while deterring, while being ready to defend, and managing this problem, that's going to persist as long as the Kim family regime is in power.
Thank you. Ambassador Joe DeTrani, a question came in for you saying that you mentioned China and Russia are discussing denuclearization options. We'd like to know what your thoughts are on that and how can China help in the transition of North Korea into a peaceful, reunified Korean Peninsula. What would China's role be there? So first, what's the denuclearization options that Russia and China have talked about?
Well, I think Russia and China are with the United States when we talk about complete, verifiable denuclearization. I don't think either Russia or China wants to see North Korea with nuclear weapons. Now, having said that, I think the approach to achieving that goal, I think the China and Russia have a different view on that. They've talked about a freeze for a freeze, where we have to be much more flexible. We have to be lifting to these sanctions. We should be giving some incentives to North Korea to move towards denuclearization. No, I think the point I made was, in the comments I made initially, was that indeed, if we continue on the path we're on now with more sanctions, a greater missile defense, a greater deterrence capabilities in the region, I think we could possibly see or likely see China and Russia going their own way and not implementing the sanctions the way we would all like them to implement them and giving them that safety net there. So I think we have to be cohesive there and keep Russia and China on board with us and the ROK and Japan as we seek denuclearization. So I think that was the power of the six-party talks, I might add. China hosted those talks at the request of the United States, and we did have some partial success there for a few years. So I think there's a model there, but that model also indicated that the Libya model doesn't apply. North Korea is not just going to give up their nuclear weapons, and then we'll talk about lifting sanctions, and then we're talking about a path to a normal relationship. As David indicated, their nuclear weapons speak to their survival. It's not only their deterrence, it's their survival. It's the regime's survival. And they always look at the United States thinking about regime change. So they're very paranoid, if that's the word, and I'll use that word, on that issue there. So we have to convince them that moving in that direction, they will get the security assurances and they will get a process that lends itself to normal relations. And that will transform a total relationship and it will bring peace to the region, but indeed lend itself to reunification of a denuclearized North Korea.
All right, I'm going to open this for anyone in the panel. This is a representative, a legislator from Nevada, actually, Mr. Bob Kaufman. He's also a city council member in Las Vegas for years. He says his opinion is South Korea should take the lead and retain the leadership relations with North Korea and not count on the USA anymore. Any thoughts on that? I'll open the floor.
Oh,
Go ahead, Colonel.
go ahead,
and
Joel.
then Joel. Go ahead, Colonel Maxwell, then Joel.
Yeah, I think South Korea has been trying to take the lead. I think during the Moon administration, South Korea has made many overtures trying to reach out to North Korea, and North Korea has really rebuffed them. And you look at over the past few years, what has been happening. I think that the last major engagement, I think, between North and South Korea that had a relatively positive outcome was September 19th, and the Comprehensive Military Agreement, which was a series of confidence building measures that I think South Korea faithfully implemented. The North did not implement all of them on its side, but I think that South Korea has been trying to take the lead. And I think that, the problem is not that they're not taking the lead. The problem is North Korea has been unwilling to negotiate directly with South Korea. Over to you, Joel.
Go ahead, Joel.
Look, there are certain diplomatic realities here. And the biggest reality here is that if there's any chance of North Korea negotiating on its nuclear weapons and its missiles, it has to be with the United States, because the United States is viewed by the North Koreans as the main threat to their existence. Now, that doesn't mean that South Korea shouldn't play an important role. What we should have is tag teaming, the United States and South Korea tag teaming North Korea, and have a division of labor. So there are certain issues that are very important to South Korea, such as replacing the armistice with peace arrangements, or lessening the conventional military confrontation. There are the issues that they should pursue, issues we should pursue, but do it together.
Thank you. Ambassador Christopher Hill, former U.S. ambassador to Korea, mentioned that China's role is very central to maintaining North Korea's ability to stand as a nation. Without China, it's unlikely North Korea would last very long. And he's also mentioned that the biggest fear the Chinese have is that if the peninsula is reunified, the US Army will be on their border as an enemy. Jim, you got any thoughts on that? How can we, he said, if we can also help the Chinese see a future of a prosperous Korean peninsula that's not an enemy to China. What are the possibilities there? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I am not a big believer that the PRC has the United States best interests at heart. And I do believe, that they believe that North Korea is a buffer for them. And so they're happy to keep the Kim regime in some sense in place as that buffer. But I do believe that trying to think that we're going to rely on China and have some kind of meeting of the minds where we're going to come up with an agreement on how to unify the Korean Peninsula, I just don't personally believe that is what the PRC's strategic goals are. I don't see it in any of their writings. I don't see it in any of their actions. And I think the last thing I'll just say is, as I sat here this hour listening, I spent most of my career over in the Pacific, and for most of my career at one time or another, I was getting up every 90 to 180 days having to tell my boss why the North Koreans had fired a missile or tested a nuclear weapon or done something. And when I think back in this last 4 years, it's the quietest 4 years we've had on North Korea's activity. And I know that it's probably not politically correct to say this, but I think we need to hear some assessments, and we're running out of time, but what happened in the last 4 years that caused Kim Jong-un and the Kim family to stay quiet in this area of military and nuclear testing, nuclear weapons testing, and ICBM testing, and even provocative acts? And what was it that caused them to do that? And I don't think people really want to talk about that. And I think they should, because I think there was real actions that occurred in the last 4 years that caused that to happen. And that's a change in the previous 30 years.
So Jim, can I just follow up on that for 1 second?
Yes.
Jim, as you saw, we all saw in 2017, North Korea with the 6th nuclear test, with the certainly the Hwasong 14 and 15, they were really expanding. And then you're correct. starting in 2018, and again, to give a lot of credit to President Moon Jae-in with his meeting with Kim Jong-un and the Panmunjom Declaration, setting the stage for the Singapore dialogue with President Donald Trump. I think that was seminal. I think that Singapore Declaration was a seminal event where North Korea was looking at what they want is a normal relationship with the United States. They do want that peace treaty to end the Korean War. And they realize complete verifiable denuclearization is on the table, and that's part of the equation. So I think Kim Jong-un was hoping that would lend itself. And that's why in Hanoi, there was such disappointment in Pyongyang that it didn't go, because it was basically a Libya model. You got to give everything up and put everything on the table and so forth. He wasn't expecting that. So, and I think he's still holding back, Jim, further to the last point on this, is he's still holding back, hoping that the Biden administration will pick up on where Trump was in Singapore in June of 2018, and hopefully keep that dialogue going there. Because he's put a marker down with the 8-party Congress where he said, look, if that doesn't go that way, we're going to enhance our nuclear and our missile capabilities, and we're just going to keep running in that direction.
Well, I can't thank our panelists enough for this wonderful session. We certainly need another few minutes to go forward, but our time has run out. We will invite all of you back for another follow-up webinar in the near future. I want to thank Mr. James Fennell and Mr. Joel S. Witt and Colonel David Maxwell and Ambassador Joseph Tetrani. And I'd like to give each of you one moment just to give your final remarks, starting with David.
Yes, thank you very much. I would just like us to remember to keep in mind what are Kim Jong-un's objectives and the objectives of the Kim family regime. It's zero sum between North and South. And while I want to reach a negotiated solution, I want to keep in mind that North Korea accuses us of having a hostile policy toward the North. The North has a hostile policy towards the South. And it ultimately seeks to dominate the Korean Peninsula. It's told us that, its constitution tells us that, its Workers' Party charter tells us that, and the statements of the regime tell us that. And we should listen to them. And so it's a zero-sum game between North and South. And so we have to be able to protect our ally, and we must keep in mind what the Kim family regime's real objectives are. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
I'd just say it's an honor to participate. And for the South Korean friends that are listening today, kapshi kapshi da, we go together. And that's the message that the United States needs to send to our friends in South Korea, that we're together and we need to work on this together. And what David said about the reality of North Korea, we can't lose that. And so we have to be shoulder to shoulder on this problem.
Thank you. Joel?
Thank you very much. There's one point that I really do want to make. And as having been a policymaker and having listened for 30 years to different viewpoints about what North Korea wants, what it thinks, what it's like, people have to understand that there are many different views on that. It's not clear and simple. And that's part of the problem of being a policymaker. And that's one of the arguments for diplomacy, to talk to them face to face and to try to figure it out.
Thank you very much, Joel. And Ambassador Tetrani.
Just briefly, thank you for the invitation, a great discussion. Look, over 26 years of negotiations with North Korea, we know when we're negotiating with them, they're doing what you just said, Jim. They're not launching missiles or maybe some short-range ballistic missiles, but certainly not ICBMs, and they're not having nuclear tests. But when we're not talking with North Korea, there is an escalation. So diplomacy, a dialogue is so important, and hopefully that dialogue will lend itself to a transformation of a relationship with North Korea, where North Korea realizes they will get what hopefully Kim Jong-un wants. And that's greater prosperity for the 24 million people living in North Korea. I think we can get into these discussions of the nuclear weapons and the cyber and capability. There are 24 million people, and many of them are living in poverty. David talked about the human rights issues there. There are so many imperatives there that speak for getting a dialogue going and getting some progress going in regards to relations with North Korea, but also between the North and the South.
Well, once again, thank you to all of our distinguished panelists and experts on Korea. I would say, Jim, the Washington Times totally agrees with you. The past administration made some very firm steps forward with the process of bringing some kind of engagement. And it was written up in the Times just 2 days ago that the Biden administration is leaning towards taking on much of the Trump policy towards China because they realize it actually had some very good developments that are going on. So I want to thank all of our panelists and thank you to our audience. We have over 800 people online and 154 directly on the Zoom. Very, very honored to share this time with you. Mr. Larry Moffett, could you please come back and tell us about our next webinar and we'll conclude.
I am back. Thank you very much. Next week, we have we're going to be talking more about, not so much about North Korea itself, but about the Indo-China, or rather Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, or as some policy people have contracted it, the Indo-Asia-Pacific, and the strategies and the big, it's not a chess match, it's a go match in that region of the world. And we're going to have some very fine speakers on that. So we invite you back next Tuesday at the same time, 2 to 3 o'clock. Everybody, thank you very much. They say leave them wanting more. I think everybody here wants more, but we're at the end of our time. And we're truly grateful that you came. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.